So good morning, everyone. I see we're still gathering here in the audience, but we want to make sure that we have time for our fabulous speakers, so we're going to get started. Welcome to our special Grand Round celebration of community health improvement. Nationally, organizations are taking the time to raise awareness around the community health improvement activities. And at Children's National, we are taking this opportunity to celebrate the work we do across the organization, both internally and externally, to build healthier lives for our children. The Child Health Advocacy Institute, which I lead, is excited that you are sharing in our celebration by participating in this month's activities. And you can find more about the work that we're going to be doing and the activities that we're going to engage in this month on the Community Affairs website at childrensnational.com. We think our celebration this month is going to be pretty exciting, and we're hoping that you're going to take the time to be actively involved in all that we're going to do. And on June 19th, we are going to host a symposium on school and health and the need for the integration of those two sectors to work more closely together around improving the health of our children. I want to take just one moment to thank the leaders who have helped to create the programs that you'll experience this month. And that is the team of directors in the Child Health Advocacy Institute. Dr. Lanre Falusi, Dr. Lee Beers, Desiree De La Torre, Dr. Chaya Merrill, and Dr. Danielle Dooley. They've worked tirelessly to make sure that you experience in a very real way the community work that we are doing here at Children's National. We also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, and in particular, we want to thank Wendy Goldberg, who is a tireless advocate for children. She helps to make the work that we're going to do this month possible. Also, our Children's National Nursing Education team, particularly Simi King, our Nursing Director of Clinical Information Systems and Professional Development. Nursing Education's hospital-wide collaboration on trauma-informed care have been transformative, and we appreciate the engagement that they have in supporting the work that we do across this important issue. And finally, this Grand Round is our annual science lecture. Mary and Jeff Science have been friends of Children's National for many years. They fund community mental health initiatives at Children's to honor Jeff's father, Alan, who is a noted psychiatrist now living in New York. We are grateful for their ongoing generosity and pleased to present Dr. Nadine Burke Harris as this year's Grand Round speaker. Dr. Nadine Burke Harris is a pediatrician and a leader in the movement to transform how we respond to early childhood adversity and the resulting toxic stress that can harm the bodies and brains of children. By exploring the science behind childhood adversity, she offers a new way to understand the adverse childhood experiences that affect us throughout our lifetime. You may have seen her TED Talk, I know I have, as it's been viewed by nearly 4 million people. Dr. Burke Harris recently published a book on the issue of childhood adversity called The Deepest Well, Healing the Long-Term Effects of Childhood Adversity. Her work has also earned her numerous awards and accolades, and we are honored to have her join us today. I had the pleasure of sharing dinner with Dr. Burke Harris last night, and she said something that really resonated with me. She said ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, not just a word, it's not just a label. It is hope. It is the science behind what we can do and achieve to help improve the life of children who've had these adverse childhood experiences. And so I'm excited to learn more from her today about her work and the new vision that she has, and how we all can work together to make a movement to create the change that will improve the life of our children. Dr. Burke Harris.
Thank you. Wow. Oh, it's a full house. Thank you so much. This is so joyful for me. And I have slightly too many slides, so I'm just going to dive in. And if I skip a few at the end, it's okay. But I really wanted to be here to share with you everything that I know about the science of ACEs and toxic stress and how we can address it, particularly as primary care clinicians. So this work, that did not move forward. Hang on. Okay, we'll try it a different way. All right, so this work really started over a decade ago for me when I opened a clinic in a very low-income, underserved neighborhood of San Francisco called Bayview Hunters Point. And what I was experiencing was a lot of patients were being referred to me for ADHD, right? And folks would say, oh, Dr. Burke, this is before I was married, can you see Bobby, right? Bobby's hitting the kid next to him, he's falling out in class, please act like he's not paying attention. He's got ADHD, can you put him on some Ritalin, right? And when I went ahead and did a thorough history and physical, what I noticed was a very concerning trend, which was my patients who had the worst symptomatology were also the patients who seemed to have the worst histories in that H&P, right, of adversity. Kids who were witnessing violence at home or in their communities, or kids who were had parents who were mentally ill or substance dependent. And the funny thing was, it wasn't just their behavior, it was also other health outcomes, right? So like my 10-year-old patient who, as I was sitting down to go over her asthma triggers, right, and I'm, you know, is it pet dander, is it pollen, like what could it be? Her, you know, I was asking her mom, what do you notice? Like, when do you notice that her asthma tends to be activated? And her mom said, you know, doctora, I noticed that my daughter's asthma tends to act up every time her dad punches a hole in the wall. And so that's what got me looking into the research, into trying to better understand how early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And that's how I came across the adverse childhood experiences study. So for those who are, how many folks feel like they're kind of very familiar with the ACE study and the ACE data? Okay, so it's a very mixed group, so this is great. So I'll take the time to talk about, so the ACE study, it was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. It was published in 1998, so now it's been 2 decades now, right? And in it, they asked about 17,500 adults about their history of 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences. And these include physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where a parent was mentally ill, substance dependent, incarcerated, where there was parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you get a point on your ACE score. And then they correlated ACE scores against health outcomes. And what they found were 2 things that kind of defied common wisdom, right? The first thing was that ACEs were super common. 2/3 of the population had at least 1. 1 in 8 folks had 4 or more, right? And unlike the population that I serve in Bayview Hunters Point, this was not a low-income black and brown community. This was not a community of immigrants. This was a community that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated, right? And we've seen this now replicated across the country. where we collect national data on child ACEs as part of the National Child Health Survey, and we collect statewide data on ACEs as part of the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Program. And all of the states reporting their data report between 55 and 60, I want to say 62% of the population with at least one ACE, and between 13 and 17% of the population with 4 or more ACEs. And so here we see a state ranking map of child ACEs based on the National Survey of Children's Health, right? We see this is across every racial and ethnic group. This is from the behavioral risk factor data in California, where I was surprised, honestly, to see that the prevalence of ACEs were very, very similar among whites, African Americans. Latinos had the highest prevalence in California, and Asians and Pacific Islanders. So when we look at the prevalence, right, the scope of the problem, we're talking about a problem where between 55 and two-thirds of our population, 55% to 2/3, have at least one ACE, and between 13 and 17% have 4 or more ACEs. So prevalence, wide prevalence, check, right? The second thing that they found that, again, defied common wisdom was that these ACEs had a dose-response relationship between not just the typical things that we would think of, mental health problems, behavioral problems, risk of substance use, and high-risk behavior, right? We definitely saw that. But in addition, what we also saw was an increased risk of the leading causes of death in the United States. So there was a dose-response relationship between adverse childhood experiences and cancer, COPD, Alzheimer's, stroke, right? And for an individual with 4 or more ACEs, and remember we're talking about 13 to 17% of the U.S. population, their relative risk of heart disease was double. For cancer, 2.3. For chronic lung disease, triple. For stroke, 2.5 times. Alzheimer's, 11 times. Diabetes, 1.5 times. Suicide, 30 times. For those of you in the audience who are super familiar with the ACE data, you'll recognize that these numbers are a little bit different than the numbers from the original ACE study. And the reason for that is because this is the data published by Hughes et al. These numbers are updated by Hughes et al.'s meta-analysis of global ACE data, looking at ACE data across over 20 countries in the world, right? So this is kind of the most updated data. And what we see is that without intervention, right, individuals who have high ACEs, 7 or more, face a 20-year difference in life expectancy, right? So when the original investigators, Vince Felitti and Robert Onda, saw this data, right, it was shocking. But of course, the first thing that they postulated was, okay, well, what is the mechanism here? It's that if you have a rough childhood, if you're exposed to adversity, you're more likely to drink and smoke and engage in these health-damaging behaviors, and that is what leads to this increased risk of disease. And they're partially right, but I'm going to put an asterisk there. We're going to come back to that, right? So when you look at ACEs and health-damaging behavior, again, we see this dose-response relationship. The higher your ACE score, the more you are likely to smoke, to be dependent on alcohol, and to engage in high-risk behaviors in terms of early intercourse, teen pregnancy, and teen paternity, right? And we see this dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes and health risk behavior. But fortunately, a bunch of very smart researchers decided to dive deeper into this link between ACEs and health-damaging behavior and poor health outcomes. And it turns out if you do the logistic regression analysis, health-damaging behavior only attenuates your risk, only accounts for about 50% of your relative risk. So wait a minute. If you have an ACE score of 7, your relative risk of ischemic heart disease is 360%. You're 3.5 times as likely to develop heart disease as a person with an ACE score of 0. And even if you don't engage in any health-damaging behavior, you only attenuate your risk by 50%. That hardly seems fair, right? Like, how does that happen? And this is why understanding the biology of adversity and the physiologic mechanisms are so important. Because when we understand the mechanism, right, that's when we get creative, right, and develop interventions to interrupt those mechanisms, right? So for those of you who have seen me talk before, don't give it away. So we now understand over the past 2 decades, right, we've been very busy, and what we've been doing as a field is understanding the mechanisms by which early adversity increased risk for disease and early death, right, morbidity and mortality. And fundamentally, it all comes down to our fight or flight response. And it works a little something like this. So imagine you're walking in a forest and you see this guy, right? Did I scare you? This is my scariest bear picture that I could find on the internet, right? So what happens? What happens, right? Immediately, our amygdala sounds the alarm, right? Activates our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and our sympathoadrenomedullary axis. So our body starts pumping out adrenaline and cortisol, right? And so our heart starts to pound, right? Our pupils dilate, our airways open up. We raise our blood sugar and our blood pressure so that we can efficiently deliver high amounts of oxygen and nutrients, glucose, to our large skeletal muscles so that we can either fight that bear or get away, right? But if you were to think about it, fighting a bear wouldn't seem like a good idea, would it? No, look at him, he's got teeth, he's got claws, right? And that's why our amygdala sends projections to our prefrontal cortex, right? And when we have high activation of the amygdala, it downregulates the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, right, which we know is responsible for judgment, impulse control, executive functioning, because you don't want impulse control getting in the way of survival, right? And instead, what the brain does, it turns up the noradrenergic nucleus of the locus coeruleus, or as I like to call it, the part of the brain responsible for, I don't know karate, but I do know co-raising, right? This is our within the brain stress response center, works on a noradrenaline circuit, right? And it's responsible for getting us amped up. Now, the other thing that happens that is a little bit less obvious when we activate our stress response is that it also activates our immune response, right? Because if that bear gets its claws into you, you want your immune system to be primed to bring inflammation to stabilize that wound so that you can live long enough to either beat that bear or get away, right? It's brilliant. It was evolved over millennia to save our lives from a mortal threat. But the problem is what happens when this bear comes home every night. And this system, this biological mechanism, is repeated over and over and over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. And what we see as a result is long-term dysregulation of the sympathoadrenomedullary and hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axes. They lose their feedback inhibition, and so you have overactivity of these systems and difficulty turning off the stress response. We have overactivation of the amygdala, which leads to an increased fear response. Inhibition of the prefrontal cortex, leading to impaired executive functioning. Does any of this sound like ADHD to you? Right? Just saying, right? We have toxicity of the hippocampus, right? Leading to difficulty with learning and memory. And now I'm going to come back to that asterisk, right? Because this last piece, the changes to the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, which is the reward and pleasure pathway of the brain. It runs on a dopamine circuit, and what we see is that individuals who have experienced high doses of adversity have changes to the structure and function of their VTA reward circuit, right? And this is in large part what leads to the increased risk of engaging in high-risk behavior, right? We know our VTA is stimulated by cocaine, heroin, sex, high sugar, high fat foods, gambling, all these things that feel really good. And what we see in individuals who have experienced high doses of adversity, right, is that this reward pathway is individuals get slightly less activation of that dopamine circuit with a stimulation that should be pleasurable. And so we see increased risk of substance dependence and increased risk of high-risk behavior. Now, when people talk about adverse childhood experiences, right, and they talk about the effects, somehow it seems to all stop at the neck, and that drives me bonkers, right? For all of you all who are clinicians, right, pediatric clinicians, please do not forget about the rest of the body, right? Because what we see in the disruption to our hormonal system, long-term changes to ACTH, also corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH, long-term changes to adrenaline, cortisol, and other hormones lead to increased stress activation in the body. We see changes in growth hormones, thyroid hormones, pubertal hormones, right, that affect our growth, development, metabolism, and puberty. And we also see changes in leptin and ghrelin that lead to increased risk of overweight and obesity. In terms of the immunologic changes, we see increased inflammatory mediators and markers of inflammation, inhibition of anti-inflammatory pathways, lead to increased risk of viral infection, certain bacterial infections, and chronic inflammation. From the cardiovascular standpoint, every time you have that overactivation of the stress response, that adrenaline, you have that increased chronotropic and inotropic effect on the cardiovascular system. What does that lead to? Increased blood pressure, force of the blood through the body, through the blood vessels, increased turbulence, right, of the blood flow, which leads to wear and tear, damage and micro tears to the vascular endothelium, right? So what happens? You have tears in the vascular endothelium, that leads to inflammation, and there we see dramatically increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And this can start to be measured in individuals as young as their 20s in terms of changes in things like plasma endothelin-1, total peripheral resistance, diastolic blood pressure, and pulse wave velocity. And ultimately, if you think about, all right, I get it. If you got an overactive stress response, I could see why you would have all these health effects if you're a kid. But the Kaiser study, right, the Kaiser CDC study, those folks were adults. The mean age was over 55 years old, right? So how is it these folks are still having health problems long after they're away from the stressor that was precipitated? And this has to do with the long-term changes to the brain and body as a result of this overactive stress response. High doses of stress hormones affect our epigenetic regulation in two ways, right? Actually, affect our DNA regulatory mechanisms in two ways. One, epigenetic regulation, right, which affects the way DNA is read and expressed, right? And that leads to changes in the way the brain and organ systems respond to stress. And a lot of this epigenetic programming happens in early life, right? And it sets the programming, unless there's intervention, for lifelong changes in the functioning of these receptors and cellular mechanisms. And then the other piece is telomere erosion, right? So, you know, telomeres are like the bumpers on the ends of your DNA, and the shorter they get, right, that leads to cellular aging. And there's a bunch of things that wear out your telomeres. Toxins wear out your telomeres. Cigarette smoke leads to premature telomere erosion. And childhood adversity also leads to premature telomere erosion, right? And so when telomeres get too short, then when the cell goes to replicate, a couple of things can happen. Either one, bless you, either one, right, the cell replicates inaccurately, you get mutations and you have increased risk of cancer, or you have cellular senescence, right, which is premature cell death, If you're an islet cell in the pancreas, that means that that cell is no longer making insulin, and you have increased risk of diseases like diabetes. So the combination between early life adversity, this mechanism of early life adversity that is modulated by protective factors and predisposed vulnerability, leading to neuroendocrine, immune, cardiovascular, and genetic regulatory disruption, is what the American Academy of Pediatrics now calls toxic stress, right? And this condition is what leads to these long-term changes in terms of endocrine, metabolic, reproductive, neurologic, psychiatric, behavioral, immune, inflammatory, and cardiovascular long-term disease. Now, when the original researchers did this investigation, what they found was that they did in adults, and they were looking at, increased risk of heart attack and stroke and all that kind of stuff. But we know that this begins in childhood. And so one of the things that my team at the Center for Youth Wellness set out to do was understand, right, can we recognize symptoms of toxic stress in childhood? And it turns out we can. So early life adversity is associated, right, through this pathway of this dysregulated stress response. The signs and symptoms of toxic stress are evident as early as infancy, right? So we can see in babies, we see developmental delay, growth delay, failure to thrive, and sleep disruption. In school-age kids, we see increased risk of asthma, pneumonia, viral infection, atopic disease, learning difficulties, and behavioral problems. And in adolescence, we begin to see increased risk of obesity, diabetes, headache, abdominal pain, teen pregnancy, hyperthyroidism, and other autoimmune disease, as well as pubertal changes. So that's really scary, right? Like, oh, that sounds awful. But believe it or not, right, this is the part where I get excited, because when we do a deep dive into the science of toxic stress, listen, childhood adversity has been going on since God was a boy, right? It's almost a truism, right, that, oh, you had a rough childhood, yeah, you're more likely to have all these problems. But now that we understand these mechanisms, right, then we get to have fun and mess around and figure out how do we interrupt these biological pathways. So one of the first things that my team did when we, first read the ACE study and were learning about this is we went ahead and we did a retrospective chart review to see the impact of ACEs on our patient population. Like, okay, sure, those folks, those middle-class Caucasian folks in San Diego, they might have had ACEs, but who knows whether my patients do or not, right? So we wanted to look at the evidence. And what we found when we did a retrospective chart review was very similar to the ACE data. Our patients had 67% of them had at least one ACE, and 12% had 4 or more ACEs. The big difference is in the original ACE study, their mean age was 55. They were asking retrospectively which of these happened to you by the time you were 18. In our study, we were just doing a chart review, right, seeing what was documented. And, by the way, I'm a mandated reporter, right? But the other piece was that the mean age of our patient population was 8, right? So for most of our kids, they likely were not done accumulating ACEs. But for our kids who had, and we looked at 2 health outcomes. One was learning and behavior problems, and one was overweight or obesity. For our kids who had 4 or more ACEs, they were twice as likely to be overweight or obese as our patients with 0 ACEs. These kids are all living in the same food desert. They're all living in the same neighborhood. They all have access to the same safe or not so safe places to play, right? But for our kids with 4 or more ACEs, they were twice as likely to be overweight or obese. For our kids who had 4 or more ACEs, they were 32.6 times as likely to have learning and behavior problems in school, right? So if you had 0 ACEs, if our kids had 0 ACEs, only 3% of them had learning and behavior problems. And if they had 4 or more ACEs, 51.2% had learning and behavior problems. As far as I'm concerned, that's a crazy effect size, right? And what was nuts about it, so I almost missed the good news, right? And let me just tell you the good news. For our Black and brown kids in Bayview Hunters Point, if they had 0 ACEs, only 3% of them had learning and behavior problems, right? So for me, it just felt it was such a validation that our kids are not broken, right? These are kids who are being told that something is wrong with them when our data was saying that these problems directly correlated with toxic doses of adversity. And what was fascinating about this, there's 2 things, and there's one thing I'll take a second to flag, which is that the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, right, when they came up with the definition of toxic stress, right, which, by the way, this is the choir, so I want to make sure that I'm clear. Toxic stress is not the stressor. If you read any paper, New York Times, whatever it is, people say, toxic stress is being separated from your caregiver, or it's being deported, or it's living in poverty, or something. That is not toxic stress. It is not the stressor. It is the stress response. It is the physiologic response, the dysregulation of the stress response system and the changes to the neuroendocrine, immune, and genetic regulatory system. That is toxic stress. It's the physiologic response. But when the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child came up with the definition of toxic stress after reviewing all of the literature, the critical part was these long-term changes to the stress response, brain development and architecture, and organ systems in absence of buffering, of an adequate buffering caregiving system. And I want to point something out here, which is that for our low-income kids in Bayview Hunters Point, right, there's actually something really special about ACEs. It's not that stress, right, leads to chronic disease. We have the system that's designed to help us respond to stress, right? But when the funny thing about the ACEs, I think the thing that was kind of magic that Salidi and Adhd stumbled across is that when you look at the 10 ACEs, they all do double duty of simultaneously stressing a kid out and inhibiting their buffering caregiving system, right? And that's why we see such a dramatic effect size when it comes to the 10 particular ACEs. Because if you look at the data internationally, for example, refugee children around the world, even going through that horrible experience, if they have an intact and adequate buffering caregiving system, they actually tend to do okay. They have much better outcomes than if they simultaneously experience a stressor and have the dismantling of their buffering caregiving system, which I think is really critical to understand. So, the reason understanding the mechanism and the physiology is so important is because if we look at a graph of prefrontal cortical activity, right, relative to catecholamine, right, we know it's this inverted U-shaped curve. If you don't have enough catecholamine, you can't function, pay attention. If you have too much, it's like you drank 50 cups of coffee and you can't focus to save your life, right? Now, what's the #1 treatment in the United States of America for ADHD? Stimulants, right? Ritalin, Adderall, Strattera. And that makes sense because if you are working with a physiology where you have underfunctioning of the prefrontal cortex, you give a stimulant and you improve PFC functioning. But the problem is if you have equal level of inhibition of the prefrontal cortex, right, but it's due to catecholaminergic overload, then adding a stimulant may not help, right? And this is why it's really important to understand which side of this curve our patients are on when we are administering the medication, right? So if a patient's over here, I know there's a couple of really important things I have to do. Number 1, I have to reduce the dose of adversity. Number 2, I have to enhance the capacity of their buffering caregiving system. And number 3, when we do use a medication, our first-line medication isn't a stimulant. In our center, usually we start with something like guanfacine, right? Guanfacine that was originally developed as a blood pressure lowering medication. It regulates the release of noradrenaline from the nucleus accumbens, right? And what we see with a lot of our patients with ACEs is that we see a better clinical response, because I'm sure everyone in this room has seen the case of, yeah, this kid, they've got terrible ADHD, the Ritalin doesn't seem to be working, so we added an antipsychotic, right? So we added another medication rather than looking, wait a minute, are we treating the appropriate physiology? So all of the research and all of the science, when it comes to the science, the biology of toxic stress, tells us that early identification and intervention are critical. When we identify early, we have the opportunity to take advantage of neuroplasticity and other forms of development of the child's brain and organ system to help them heal in, to help them develop in a much healthier way, right? Because the good news about kids, when people say kids are resilient, kids have a tremendous capacity for resilience if we give the appropriate intervention and we give it early. So in our center, we screen every child for adverse childhood experiences. And this is the screening tool that we use. We list the 10 original ACEs up top, and we list the supplemental ACEs down the bottom. And we don't ask to our patients, which ACEs did you experience, right? We started out doing that. It took a really long time, right? And as we recognize, wait a minute, if we are trying to develop a system to get every kid screened for ACEs and make sure this is something that's easy to do in the primary care home, right? We can't have something that's going to take 45 minutes or be in a situation where providers are afraid to get a positive answer, right? And so what we did was say, you don't have to tell us which ACEs your child has experienced, only how many. And a parent will put a number in this box, a number in that box. We do the screening for 0 to 12. It's a parent report. From 13 to 19, there's a parent report and also a child self-report that are done separately. And what this allows us to do is tell us immediately, in 3 minutes or less, whether this child is at low risk, moderate risk, or high risk of having a toxic stress physiology, right? And then, listen, in primary care, it's not going to be my job to solve the entire issue. We have to work with our colleagues and do things like integrated primary care and behavioral health, team-based care, referring to community resources, right? But understanding whether this child has a toxic stress physiology is really important for me to understand how I do my job. And I'll show you a quick example of how that happens. So this is a patient I saw, 2-year, 9-month female, came in for her well child exam. And the only concern that mom had was that she was gross. She seemed like she was small. She had a little bit of diarrhea when she started on cow's milk at 1 year, but the symptoms went away when mom changed her to almond milk. Otherwise, no complaints. And this was a family who had moved from across the country. This was their first visit with me. So she was born full term, normal spontaneous vaginal delivery. Birth weight was at the 25th percentile. Her length was at the 50th percentile. And her developmental history was totally normal. No behavioral concerns, no social, emotional, language, fine motor, gross motor, all that kind of stuff. But she had progressively decreased in her percentiles until she was consistently below the 3rd percentile for height, weight, and head circumference. And her previous doctor had said, wow, this looks like failure to thrive, right? And started her on the #1 treatment for failure to thrive, nutritional supplementation, Pediatric. But it didn't seem to help. And so mom was right. Here's her, it's a little tough to see. So her length starts out here and drops below the 3rd percentile and stays there consistently. Her weight starts out here, drops below the 3rd percentile, and stays there consistently. So on my exam, she had a normal physical exam, normal initial lab, ASQ was normal, MCHAT was normal, Her ACE score was a 7+0. So now I understand this is a almost 3-year-old girl with failure to thrive, likely due to a toxic stress physiology. And when we look at all of the data around what interventions are, what is the current best evidence for addressing a toxic stress physiology, we understand it's sleep, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, mental health, and healthy relationships, right, are really where we have the strongest evidence right now. And so I referred this patient for child-parent psychotherapy. As well as, so for this patient, we focused on nutrition, mental health, and healthy relationships. So we referred her to child-parent psychotherapy, and also, in addition, recommended that can of Pediatrician twice a day, right? And referred her to WIC to make sure that they could actually get it. So one of the pieces that was really critical was the framing, explaining to mom what was going on. So I said, I think because of what your daughter's experienced, her body may be making more stress hormones than it should, and this may be what's affecting her growth. I want to refer you to a specialist that can help you learn about how to support her and reduce the amount of stress hormones that her body is making, right? My target is to reduce the dose of adrenaline and cortisol in this girl's body, right? But the mechanism that I have to do it is through child-parent psychotherapy. The other thing I said was, we know that a healthy caregiver is one of the most important ingredients for healthy kids. So an important part of helping your daughter heal will involve managing your own stress level and practicing taking care of yourself. So we connected her to CPP. We did a warm handoff would be the gold standard, but referral with follow-up is far more typical, even in our center where we have integrated care. And the other piece that was critical was for me to discuss with a treating mental health clinician, right? Here's a kid who's got no mental health symptoms, but I'm sending her to you for child-parent psychotherapy to treat her growth failure, right? So we got buy-in from the entire team, including mom, about the diagnosis and the treatment plan. And within 6 months, this girl was back on the growth curve. And when we see, so let me just say this, by the way, because I just saw this kid in follow-up very recently. When she first came to me, her growth velocity was 2.1 centimeters per year at age 3, when her growth velocity should be 7 to 8 centimeters per year. When I saw her in follow-up last week, her growth velocity, she was 4, right? Normal growth velocity for a 4-year-old is 6 to 7 centimeters per year. What I set as my clinical outcome target, this is what we're treating to. This is our treatment endpoint, is normal growth velocity. Last week, her growth velocity was 6.3 centimeters per year, right? That's what the difference of understanding the toxic stress physiology can make and targeting the underlying biology. So we know that it's neuroendocrine, immune, and genetic regulatory disruption. But we have a really big challenge because right now there are currently no clinical diagnostic criteria for toxic stress. But an ACE screen is a really important way to help us identify patients who may be experiencing a toxic stress physiology, right? Just because the ICD-10 hasn't put a code on it doesn't mean this physiology doesn't exist in our patient's body, right? And so using this information and the science to help deliver more efficient and more effective care is critical. So this treatment strategy was reducing the dose of adversity, decreasing the activation of the HCA and SAM axes, decreasing the total dose of adrenaline and cortisol and the dysregulation, enhancing the ability of the caregiver to provide a safe, stable, and nurturing environment, as well as regulate her own physiology so that she can be a buffer to her child. And in this case, especially with young children, the 2-generation nature of child-parent psychotherapy was really critical. And in our center, the interventions that we use are based on the developmental stage, right? So in school-age kids, we begin to do things like biofeedback and neurofeedback to help them regulate their autonomic nervous system. And in older kids, adolescents, we start doing things like bringing in more of the mindfulness and other practices to help them regulate their stress response. Interesting corollary here, the 9-month-old brother of this patient, who was not the index patient, had 4 ear infections and 2 pneumonias in his first year of life, right? So he earned himself the requisite referral to ENT for the, frequent ear infection, 4 infections in a year. But after we started this child-parent psychotherapy intervention, he had many fewer URIs, no more ear infections, and no pneumonias in the subsequent year. So despite the fact that this data was published now 2 decades ago, of the 33,000 primary care pediatricians that are registered with the AAP, only 11% are even familiar with the ACE research, right? We're not being trained on it. And only 4% are screening for ACEs. And that really has to change. But we recognize that if we want pediatricians to screen for ACEs, we can't ask every single person to reinvent the wheel, right? Not everyone is as obsessed with ACEs and toxic stress as I am, right? Listening to Rob Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, while I'm there brushing my teeth in the morning. Literally, I do this, right? I love it, but I highly recommend that book for folks who want to learn more about the physiology of the stress response. But we can't ask everyone to do that. And so, at the Center for Youth Wellness, we reviewed over 15,000 scholarly articles to understand the pediatric health outcomes associated with childhood adversity. And we're beginning to look at some of the best measures, practices, interventions, and develop resources for pediatricians to be able to access, as well as identifying gaps and needs for future resources. And we're also doing something that I think is really cool. In partnership with UCSF in San Francisco, we're doing a large-scale randomized control trial to, number one, validate the ACE screening tool, because the AAP, so they won't recommend it until we validate it. So we're going to have a validated tool hopefully by 2020, right? And also to look at biomarkers associated, to look at the association between ACE scores and biomarkers of toxic stress so that we can begin to get some more objective measures of neuroendocrine immune dysregulation. And so we're putting that all together. We've created something called the National Pediatric Practice Community on ACEs. I encourage you guys all to become members. And this is a co-developed, digital platform where anyone can sign up, get information about the science of ACEs and toxic stress, get access to different screening tools, look at, and most importantly, share your questions and also share your learning so that we can kind of crowdsource this information and learn together about the obstacles to screening for ACEs and treating toxic stress and how we overcome them. Finally, I've talked a lot about the clinical management of evaluation and management of toxic stress, but we recognize that toxic stress is both a health condition and a public health crisis. And this is where our role of pediatrician as advocates is so critically important. The good news is, in the United States, we know how to deal with a public health crisis. It starts with sounding the alarm, right? Packaging the message, getting it in a way that we can disseminate so that folks around the country can get ready access to informed science and best practices. Engaging strategic champions. Didn't y'all see Oprah's 60 Minutes piece? Oh my God, I was screaming in my bedroom. I was yelling at my husband. I was like, baby, Oprah's talking about the ACE test, right? And then also building networks and infrastructure. And so that's also something that we're working on at the Center for Youth Wellness. We're launching a resource in addition to the National Pediatric Practice Community for providers. We're launching a public education platform for families and parents called stresshealth.org. This slide, so we did a little test and learn cycle, and we reached about 1.5 million people. That should say 650,000 folks who either shared it, liked it, did some type of engagement on social media. We had 1 million folks who viewed our little video about toxic stress. And, we've dramatically grown our social media community. But when we think about how we take this science forward in the world, and we think about the role of pediatricians as advocates, right? we recognize that if we think that we're going to solve this problem in the exam room, right, we're out of our mind. We have to be doing, number one, we have to be the credible voice, sharing evidence-based messages about toxic stress in the community, and also be champions of change in every single sector of our community. So just to give a sample of what this looks like in San Francisco, there's San Francisco Unified began to implement a mindfulness program called Quiet Time. And it was actually, I think it was supported by the David Lynch Foundation. And what they saw was a reduction in school violence, right, after they implemented this program. Substantial drop in the suspension rate, increase in GPA, increase in STAR test scores. Everybody needs those standardized test scores, right? Reduction in the African-American achievement gap, and decreased psychological stress among teachers and administrators over a significant period. And this was really amazing because as they were doing this pilot in San Francisco, as I remember I had one adolescent patient who had abdominal pain. He had a high ACE score. We were working on, sleep, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, mental health, and healthy relationships. And as I was checking in, I said, okay, we start, with a strengths-based approach. Oh, how are you doing in each of these things? How are you doing on your sleep? How are you doing on your, regular exercise? How about mindfulness? And he's like, oh, yeah, I do it in my school, right, every day. And it's like the more environmental sources of buffering that we have, just like we learned how to chelate lead out of the blood of kids, right? But when we took lead out of the pipes, out of the gasoline, out of the pencils, out of the paint, right, then we saw an environmental decrease in the population level burden of lead poisoning for kids, right? This is where we need to go for toxic stress. And I believe that 20 years from now, right, we are going to be in a completely changed scenario. We'll all be like, oh, remember back in the day when we didn't use to screen for ACEs, right? It'll be like, when the mom was driving in the car with the 4 kids in the back of the station wagon, she's smoking a cigarette, none of them wearing a seatbelt, right? And our kids don't even like, nuh-uh, no way, right? That's how it's going to be. When it's like, oh, hey, you remember back in the day when we didn't use to screen for ACEs? We didn't used to do early intervention. It used to be that a kid used to be able to, get into school without his school form being signed that he's been screened for ACEs by his pediatrician, It's like all of these things. When we implement both these clinical interventions and these public health interventions, I believe that we can turn the tide on this public health crisis. Thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much for really a great and inspirational presentation, and an area that we are hard at work doing early work around implementation here at Children's National. I guess I literally have a chicken and egg question, which is we focus on children to try to get upstream. What's the evidence or opportunity for the fetal environment where moms who are pregnant with babies who are, to the degree that toxic stress or those elements are present during the pregnancy and impacting the developing baby, and what's the early evidence or research, and what are opportunities for us to be partnering and collaborating with our prenatal caregivers and OBs and others around impacting this as far upstream as we can?
Yeah, it really is a chicken and egg question, because what the science shows is that not only does the prenatal environment affect outcomes, right? So we know, so not only the prenatal environment, but also the mom's pregestational health, right? So as you can imagine, right, if you have a mom who had high ACEs in her own childhood and has neuroendocrine immune disruption, right, then when she gets pregnant, no surprise, we see increased risk of low birth weight, increased risk of fetal demise, increased risk of, lots of adverse perinatal outcomes. And particularly if mom experiences high doses of adversity during her pregnancy in the prenatal environment, right? Again, that is another time where we see it's associated with even, for example, inflammation across levels of inflammatory mediators across the placenta around expression of serotonin receptors in the placenta and other neurotransmitter receptors in the placenta. So when we really think about toxic stress as deeply affecting our physiology, then it becomes quite clear that there's a tremendous amount of work that we have to do. And I flip that on the other side, which is a tremendous amount of opportunity to improve health, right? And so one of the things we've been doing in California is working with our OB/GYN colleagues to be able to provide supports for mom and do this type of counseling for moms. But there are obstacles in every direction. They report challenges as well. So moving this work forward together is so important.
Hi, my name is Sanjeev Sriram. I'm a pediatrician across the river in Anacostia. My question, I appreciate greatly how you and the center encourage pediatricians to speak up about adversity and toxic stress outside of clinical venues. And my question has to do with how do we build greater consistency between what we say and what we do. And just to give an example, the ground floor of a hospital can screen for ACEs, but when the government relations teams advocate against paid family leave and other anti-poverty policies, it becomes really hard for pediatricians to speak with one consistent voice about adversity, and it would be better if we could actually improve that consistency. I was wondering if you have any recommendations.
Yeah. So I can only tell you what my approach is to this, which is this is a part of the reason why I love being hip deep in the evidence, right? And really making compelling arguments. And I'm going to give you an example, and I'm not going to call anybody out, but I will say, so recently there's been a lot of statements by the AAP and others around the new policy by the Justice Department around separating children from their caregiver, right? It's part of this immigration policy. And, the one thing that just drove me a little nuts about our response as pediatricians is that we say, yes, we know that keeping families together is healthier and all of these pieces. And we talked about toxic stress as toxic stress is the extreme stress that kids experience, right? That just drove me nuts. Because what happens when we say that is we say it leaves us open for the argument for people to say, oh, well, it was the parent who decided to cross the border illegally, and therefore the parent is creating that stress for the child. However, that's not what toxic stress is. Toxic stress is the physiologic response that children experience when they experience severe adversity without adequate buffering caregiving system, right? So if you as a government have decided for immigration reasons or for national security reasons, for political reasons that each of us individually may agree with or we don't agree with, right, that we're detaining these folks, right, what we know is that if you keep the families intact, as the previous administration did, you may expose the child to the stressor, but you also maintain the buffering caregiving system. When you expose the child to the same stressor, and you remove the buffering caregiving system, that simple difference in policy makes an incredibly potent recipe for toxic stress, which we will be paying for in heart disease, in substance use, in later autoimmune disease, all of these downstream factors. And that is a simple policy change that if we just look at the science, is whatever the opposite of harm reduction is, harm maximization. I personally, I feel like it is the immigration policy equivalent of using chemical weapons, right? The reason we don't do it is because it has broad downstream harm. And so that piece, I feel like we could make a much tighter and more cogent argument if we make sure that we get deep with the science.